Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Black Mental Wellness Lounge. I'm excited today to be joined with a really special guest who is having some really good impact and been doing this work for quite some time. And I'm just so excited that she was able to provide some time to come in and talk to the lounge. And so I want to present to you all Dr. Rheeda Walker. Thank you so much for jumping on. I'm excited to talk to you and get into some of the work that you're doing. Like I mentioned, I've seen you everywhere, like doing some really great stuff, and so definitely want to highlight that today. So as we get started, just introduce yourself to the lounge. Tell us a bit about yourself and your work.
Well, thank you so very much, Brandon, for this invitation. I appreciate the work that you're doing. We need all hands on deck. I can tell the audience that I come from humble beginnings. I grew up in Savannah, Georgia, in my primarily African American communities. And what happened was that when I went off to college at the University of Georgia, and I was a psychology major eventually, I just didn't feel like the reality that I grew up with was reflected in the textbooks. And so that's what prompted me to even get on this path of being invested in Black mental health. And so I'm glad to be talking to you and your audience about some of my work.
We're excited that you're here, and so I see you have your book, what I call the book, behind you. So the Unapologetic Guide to Black Mental Health. I remember when I found out about it, like there were a couple of people posting about it, and people really like connecting with the fact that there is something particular to us in Black mental health. And so, with that, tell us about, what inspired you to write the book, and tell us a bit about the book and some of the things that you go into within the book.
Well, you know this. Oftentimes, our reality gets swept away into everybody else's story and the minority people. And
Hmm.
I've been doing this work long enough to just kind of feel like we got to cut that out. The reality of Black people in the US and around the world is like no other place. And it's important for us to recognize that, for example, Black people didn't just show up in the US as slaves. And I talked to even, my son about this. Like, we're not going to say slaves. We were enslaved people. We had a whole entire culture and reality that we brought with us, one, and two is important because it allowed us to survive the very harsh reality of chattel slavery. And then add on top of that, Jim Crow legalized separation. So it's not like we left our African minds in Africa. It is still with us. And I think it's important that we recognize that. That's one of the things that I talk about in the book is the importance of our culture and how it's gotten us to where we are. But as you know, the thing that started it all was the suicide rate in our children and recognizing that there's probably a crisis brewing in our community, and understandably so. And we got to label that. So we have to label that and label it for Black people in a way that it can't be labeled in other communities. But at the same time, recognizing and truly believing in my heart that we have what we need to right the ship, to be honest.
And that's so critical, and that's why it's so refreshing to watch you create something like this, because these are topics, and these are things that we don't talk about in this way. Like we talk about Black trauma, we talk about the things that we've gone through,
Yeah.
and the oppression and systemic racism that we're still fighting, and we talk about all of those things, but we don't talk about the toll. Like we don't get into, what's the toll and how do we heal with the things that we already have, which I think is such a really cool part of your book, is that you go into the strengths that we have that are innate in us and in our culture that we can use to really heal ourselves. Like the stuff is there. And so it's really awesome to have you go into some of that. And so in your book, you talk about psychological distress and you talk about psychological fortitude specifically for Black people. And there was one specific quote that I wanted to pull out that I really like. And so it said, "The belief that we can endure anything is both a strength and a weakness of our current culture. Those having the hardest time can be least likely to ask for help because they are afraid of not appearing Black enough." Which I thought was so powerful. So talk a bit about how Black people have been conditioned to handle psychological distress, and a bit about how psychological fortitude can help us through that.
Brandon, that's a deep, weighty question.
I
And
know.
we're gonna break off some pieces of that here
Sure.
and there, starting even with the title of the book. I did not want to have mental health in the title of the book because, in my mind, when we as a community, and a lot of people, but certainly for us, we hear mental health and we think crazy. In fact, my uncle said that to me, and he read the book because he was a proud uncle. He's like, "Oh,
Yeah.
college girl got a book." He was so proud. But after he read the book, actually, you know what? I think he read maybe the first in the intro in the first chapter, and he said, "Wow, this is a book for all Black people. I thought it was for crazy
Mm,
people." And on some level, like, we almost have to be crazy to have endured what we have endured and to still be here.
mhm,
And it's almost been like a natural experiment. Like, how do you take people who are living their lives, living their best lives, regardless of how you frame it, but living their lives, snatch them up, say, we're going to put you on a totally different continent where you don't speak the language,
right,
dare you to learn to read and take care of your family and teach your children to do this for generations and
mm,
generations and generations and still be here. Like, we have evidence of what it takes for us to survive and thrive. We had Black Wall Street. Some of
right,
us are learning about it now, but a lot of generations didn't know that Black Wall Street was a thing. And it wasn't just Black Wall Street. We've had numbers of communities where we
right,
have done well for ourselves. And so we have evidence of the strength and our ability to endure. But what happened over time is that the community has, eroded in a lot of ways. Because we got the opportunity to leave the neighborhood where Big Mama was, and we
mhm,
could go wherever we want and be our big and bad self, not realizing that we needed those communities around us. And so we're out here on these islands by ourselves, still needing to be strong because that's who Black people are, right? We're still very strong. And so if you're out on an island by yourself and somehow you can't handle it, and maybe you're not as strong as you thought you were, then maybe you're, oh my goodness, weak. So then, but we keep thinking like, okay, but I got to be strong because if I'm not strong, then I'm not really Black, and that gets to be problematic. Where we dig in so much, and some of it I think is fear. And understandably so, because Black people have been taken advantage of so much in our society that we have to kind of put up this veneer of nobody can touch us, nothing can touch us. And so then that gets to be hard for us as far as getting the help that we oftentimes need with untreated anxiety, untreated depression, and as trauma and all of those things.
yeah. I mean, it's so, that's so awesome about what you're talking about, and this need for us to be, overwhelmingly strong, that we can, take anything and kind of keep going, and that even seeking help is weakness. And so much of it, like you said, is, has been conditioned because we've been through so much. And so when we're being brought up, it's like we need to make sure that you're tough enough, that you're fortified enough, to be able to deal with some of these things that, that we have to deal with, which is where I think some of the, black men can't cry, or you got to be tough and things come from, is because, of the systemic attacks that have happened on our black men and our black women. And so we have to, be strong enough to take care of those things. But help seeking is so important. And so another topic that, we talk about here a lot is, around systemic racism and all of those issues that are basically woven into, so much of the fabric of society. And now we're having like these public conversations to like, peel back these layers. And it's crazy how so many people don't know or act like they don't know that these things, right, that these things exist. And so part of that, some of the ways that some of us have tried to deal with it is through assimilation, and through trying to become a part of the dominant culture to kind of shield us from some of the weight of the things that we've dealt with through systemic racism and oppression. Um, and so, but that can also be harmful to us. And so, I think it's really critical for us to understand how, trying to assimilate in those things can be harmful to us. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
I can, and it's fascinating to me because one of the things that we know in psychology, in mental health, in our society is that you can't really be successful being someone other than who you are. That we have to connect with our authentic self, like basically faking it like we're somebody else. Like it doesn't work long term. But that's what we learned as part of our survival strategy, that if you can assimilate and be a part of this melting pot rather than a salad bowl, that'll make you more acceptable to white people. And that's what we've learned in our society, that if you can assimilate and you can talk just right, and the more that you can approximate white, Eurocentric presentation and features, then the better off you'll be. But in doing that, for those who aren't able to maintain a bicultural identity, which is a lot in and of itself, where you have to behave in one way in order to be acceptable and successful in one space, but then you have to somehow hold on to who you actually are. I mean, it's a tightrope. It's a pretty intense tightrope, and for some of us, I think we lose track of the fact that it's a tightrope, and we think, well, if I really just act right, and what we call respectability politics, if I just behave in the way that white folks will find me least threatening, then I'll be promoted, or I'll be advanced in the company, or I'll be able to live where I want to live, and my children will be protected from racism. And that's just not the case. And so sometimes, our children, sometimes people in our community are blindsided by racism. Like, I can't believe that happened. Well, racism, while it has been kind of a shapeshifter, it showed up looking one way over here and then it was another way over there. But you acknowledged it from the outset that racism permeates our society. It's interwoven. I don't care what anybody says. It's there, and so by trying to basically acquiesce to racism, it's left us vulnerable in a lot of ways. And some of us are more vulnerable than others because we didn't realize it was racism that we were up against. We didn't realize that, oh, yes, maybe a Black officer could kill a Black person because they're part of still a racist system. We're all a part of this system. And so we have to be clear about who we are in order to be able to resist the system, not internalize racism, because after a while, we start blaming Black people for Black people's problems rather than blaming the racist system. So that's one reason I had to talk about racism in the book, because I think it's such a part of like the air we breathe that we don't know that we have to be intentional about resisting it, because otherwise we will get caught up and somehow succumb psychologically in our communities, will be threatened as a result.
And I'm glad that you did tackle that in the book, and you did it in such a such an awesome way to really talk about what these things look like and what the impact can be. And yeah, I totally love that answer because it's something that you're oftentimes trying to find some solution to something that you know is ever present. So, like, if you know you're surrounded by racism and at a certain point you watch it over a generation have impact, it's like, well, let me find if this isn't working, then maybe this will work. Um, but you find out that it doesn't. It doesn't shield you from those things. Your neighborhood doesn't shield you. Your degrees doesn't shield you. Your research papers and all the success in the world doesn't shield Black people from those experiences. So finding other ways to manage that and fight against it is critical. And so that leads me to my next question, where in one of my favorite chapters in the book is that you talked about exploring and expanding meaningful blackness, which really gets into that culture piece that we were talking about earlier. And so in that chapter, you talked about different ways as a family unit that we can, explore our culture and bring our culture in order to help our mental health and mental wellness. And so could you share some examples about, how people within their families even can kind of bring culture, back into play, because so much of it sometimes we've lost some of it.
We have lost it, and again, understandably so. I don't fault us for being unwilling participants in one of the most atrocious experiments in society. And one of the things that we have to do to kind of counter the other narratives is to build up our families and intentionally connect with who we are as people of African descent. I'll never forget a student in my classroom who said, Dr. Walker, why are we talking about Africa? You don't see me sitting around beating a drum. And it was sad for me because one, he clearly needed to distance himself from his Africanness, but also I recognize that because we don't label what it means to be African, it happens and we just think, oh, Black people are just different, without recognizing that we had a cultural foundation that we brought with us. Our creativity. I think about some of the amusing things that Black people have done in response to hurt. One of the examples that I talk about in the book was, barbecuing while Black, and Becky calling the police on the folks who were just barbecuing and living life and enjoying themselves. And they turned that whole experience into one big old barbecuing while Black. I think it was the next weekend. And like the whole community came together. And those are the kinds of things that we do. We say, despite this adversity, we're going to do what makes sense to us, and in a way that sometimes we don't think about it. And that's the thing, like we don't necessarily plan and plot like, okay, this is how we XYZ. Some of that happens naturally. Other times we have to say, you know what, I'm going to sit down with the elders in the family at the next family get together, even if it's socially distanced. I'm going to sit down and ask them about what was it like for them, growing up in whatever state they grew up with. In, what did they do to survive? What kind of work did they do? What was it like for them? Because our elders are living history. Like we can find out about our families by talking to our seniors. I've asked my mom, like, well, why don't you ever talk about growing up? And she said, I wanted to protect you all from that. It was hard. It was painful. And I just don't want you to know what that was like. But we have to know our history because my mother's still here despite everything that she went through. And it's important for me and for my son and for my nieces and nephews to know where we came from, because we know if we don't know where we came from, we definitely don't know where we're going. We need to be able to go to, when we have access, as an example, to African American history museums. There's a beautiful one in DC when folks have a chance to, when it's open again and people can access it. But there are other museums around the country. We need to be intentional about educating the next generation, in part because we know a lot of our history books aren't doing what needs to be done to make sure that we know who we are. Sometimes we need to come up with customs for ourselves. We can research, Akan traditions and Yoruba, in traditions in West Africa, and create our own traditions, recognizing that there is strength and brilliance and creativity and beauty in being African. And we can resist the negative tropes that are associated with being African and replace them with a positive cultural identity, because we're going to need that in order to continue to withstand the threats and assaults to Black people that, despite best intentions and this reckoning that we seem to be in right now, that we can't count on that, but we can count on ourselves and we can count on our community and being resilient collectively, rather than saying, well, it's just about me and mine and what I can do. We have to be reliant on our community together and an educated community.
That is so, so true. For us to rebuild that community, and you're right, we're gonna have to rely on one another. And I think, thankfully, I think we're, this examination, this reckoning that you called it, it's pulling some things out, but there's still a lot of work to be done. Like there's a lot of performative things happening, a lot of those things. But it's definitely bringing up conversations, in ourselves. Like I talk about my son is 9 years old now, and he's a huge, NBA fan. And, he's literally asking me on the back of their jersey, well, what does this one mean? Like, I know it's about race and stuff, but why does he have this? Like, what does this have to do with it? I mean, we really get to explore those things. And so, it's so critical for us, like you said, that next generation coming up, to know that too. It's been a pleasure to to talk to you today. Let people know how they can get in contact with you, what your social medias are, and where to find the book. Also,
Well, the book is on Amazon. It's sold out a couple times, but it seems to be there pretty consistently now. I'm at drrheedawalker.com, and Rita is spelled a little differently, Rheed and Diamond A. And I'm on Instagram, I'm on YouTube as Dr. Rheeda Walker, and also on Twitter. You guys take care.
also, thank you so much. I appreciate you being on.